Yeah, I guess I'm coming back September 30th, so this is a little bit of a dry run, if you find me tolerable. And if you don't, then you didn't invest anything. It's perfect. I think it works out great. And thank you, Mike, for being so welcoming. It's nice, you know, you come here. I've actually been here once before. My daughter and I drove the Route 66 from Chicago to Santa Monica. And she's been texting me, go to the gift shop in Victoryville. So I guess that's what I'm doing after this. I don't know. Okay, so today we're going to talk about editing and self-editing. It's kind of the same thing. It's going to eventually become more about self-editing, but we're going to start with editing. Because as writers, we find ourselves, we're always tasked with editing someone at some point. It just falls to us. Oh, you're a writer. Could be that you are in a writer's group or in one of the critique groups that Mike was talking about. You get thrown into this situation, but you might not necessarily know at what level do I want to talk about, what kinds of things do I want to talk about, what would be helpful to somebody. And you know, it's a position of trust because you've probably gotten feedback from someone at some point that was hurtful or discouraging. And I think a lot of the art of editing, if you will, is how you can say specific things that are constructive and helpful. They're sort of the same thing, right? I mean, it's true in life too. You can say something in a different way, and somebody can really hear it, and it can really change their approach. Or you can say it in a way that makes someone go back to bed. And that's happened to me. It's happened to me quite recently, actually. Maybe I'll tell that story. Well, we're being recorded, so we'll have to change the names. Yeah, so we're going to talk about a few editing skills, and then, you know, kind of applying them to our own work, which is self-editing. First thing when you're editing someone else's work, I think, that I found very useful is to adopt a mindset of neutrality. So, you know, I don't think you get a lot out of the critic, that really harsh person or even if you have that approach, like, you can tell me whatever you want, I have a thick skin, you know. Anybody who says that is probably not true. But there's really no reason to try to pierce anyone's hide or whatever the rest of that metaphor is. So we're not really looking for criticism like that. We're also not necessarily looking for cheerleading, you know. People say, I've never heard anything like your story. You know, that's really not that helpful either. I mean, maybe a little bit of encouragement, but that's kind of like cotton candy at the fair, you know. It feels good and then you kind of feel a little sick. So I'm thinking that what we're really trying to do is present information in a matter-of-fact way. You know, my wife is a psychotherapist. She taught me this. She's taught me a lot. But in therapy, sometimes you're supposed to say, when you say X, I feel Y because of Z, right? So what that means is, I'm not right necessarily, but I'm right for me. And that is a really important approach to take when you're editing someone else's work. I don't know if this is going to be helpful to you, but when you, in this passage or with this character, it hit me in this way, it's probably because of what I've been through to this point, but you should know because I'm in your audience. And then we can get to a matter of whether or not we're talking about a consensus or it's resonating with you. So as an editor, I don't think you need to try to be objective, because you can't be, right? No one's objective. You want to be transparently subjective. Okay, that's my approach on that. And then, you know, we get to like the fact that editing is a conversation. So if you're having a conversation with somebody as opposed to an argument or a fight where you're right and they're wrong, and if only they could see the light, and you'll be here as long as it takes. I was in one of those with my psychotherapist wife just this week, and nobody learned anything, you know what I mean? Editing is a conversation in which, you know, you're trying, when you're being edited, it's what will I learn? And you have to be able, when you're being edited, to sift through. I'm sure a lot of you know what I'm going to say. You have to be able to sift through, but you're always looking for that thing that makes sense or that resonates. I was part of a literary showcase in San Diego, and everybody brought their manuscript to the table. And I thought, well, this is a great occasion for me to, I didn't go in as an expert. I didn't have Dwight reading my biography before I showed up there. He's the author of all these books, whatever. No, I'm just a writer, right? And I'm listening to people. Sometimes somebody would say one thing that would, sometimes people said like 12 things. But you never really know who it's gonna be. Can't judge a book by its cover. And you don't really know how many things they're gonna say. So you have to kind of listen to each one. So what I'm trying to say by that is, because the author, it's your responsibility to figure out what resonates. As an editor, you don't have to be right. You can just say what's on your mind and leave it to the author, as long as you have that kind of relationship. When you are editing somebody's work, I think it's also good to find the best time of day to do it. I don't know if you guys have like a best time of day when you write, or you find, I like to write, I'm a night owl, and that's when I really unhook myself and get my most creative, or I'm a morning writer. I think the same is true with editing. And so not only are you trying to find the best time to write, but you also want to allow some time when you're editing someone's work for their work to enter your conscious, then drop into your subconscious, then come back to your conscious. So if I read somebody's work right now, what I'm going to say about it is very much off the top of my head. But if I read it and then go for a 3-mile walk, what I come back is going to be much more like what I actually think. So letting it have some time, don't just getting it done, getting it off your plate, but let it sink in, like they say, sleep on it. And then the last thing I guess I want to say about editing before we move to self-editing is, when you're looking at somebody's work, you want to know what draft it's in. So my most recent book and my last book on writing, God help us all, is called Finish Your Book in 3 Drafts. And the idea being that you can finish your book in 3 drafts if you know what draft you're in. The first draft is the messy draft, in which you're just getting it all out. The second draft I call the method draft, where you've used some exercises and some feedback to help you shape what is the best thing about it and continue the promise. And then the third draft is the polished draft, where you start looking at the line editing in a certain paragraph and which parts of it have always stuck with you as not quite right. But when you're editing somebody's work, it's good to know what draft it's in. And I will tell the story now. So I'm working on a novel, and I have a group of beta readers, because everybody needs an editor. I don't want to ever be in the position in which I think I know everything about writing and I know everything about my writing. Some things I know less about than my writing, I don't know what they are, So I have one of my beta readers was responding to the first 3 chapters. Now this is a first draft. So editing a first draft really should be about what's exciting you, where you have questions, what you think some of the through lines could be. It's like really open-ended. We just don't know what's ahead of us with the first draft. Well, the feedback I got, and this is from someone who I think should know better, was like, I just think you're treading water. I think you need to go back to the beginning. I think you're just scratching the surface. And I was like, oh gosh, okay. So anytime you get feedback of any kind, you're like, it's your responsibility to take it in, because you asked for it, and you might learn and all those other good things I just said, but it really gets hard when somebody's got this. So I read it, and then I went for one of my walks. I think it was longer than 3 miles. And when I came back, I was like, this is ridiculous. This is completely inaccurate, and I just put it away. So in that sense, and I've never felt better about anything, and so in that sense, as an author, you are in charge. You're in charge of what resonates, you're in charge of what you want to do, you're in charge of what you agree with. Other people aren't right. I have a recent client who I wrote a critique for her to a draft, and she said, oh, I was just so afraid you were going to tell me to just throw the book away. I'm like, who would ever say that to you, number one? Number two, why would you ever listen to somebody? You know, like, only you can figure that out. All right. So that's a little bit about editing, and now we'll move on to self-editing. These are, you know, when you're working on your own material, it can be a little bit challenging to treat yourself like you would treat someone else. So, you know, you might want to try to apply that neutrality to yourself. You might want to try open-ended questions to yourself, rather than the feeling like, I'm a terrible writer, this is going nowhere, I should really give up. You know, you wouldn't do that to someone else, so let's not do that to ourselves. So, a couple different categories as we go, and then the numbers are there in case you're wondering, when is he going to stop droning on? When those numbers get to 18, then we're done. Okay, so number one, expandable or expendable. I like the fact that there's only one vowel that separates those. But that's a really interesting question to apply to something, because especially in an earlier draft, you might have just the stem of it. You might have the basic concept of it, but there's a lot more there. There are more characters that can come in there. You haven't quite figured out exactly what the heart of it is, but with a little bit more, you can keep what you already had. That's expandable. Expendable is cutting. You're getting rid of it. And there's something about revision, it does mean cutting. And sometimes people don't cut enough because they are holding on to their previous material. I call it the tyranny of the first draft. And I think it's because sometimes we don't know where our creativity comes from. This came to us, so therefore it has value, inherent value. And also we think our creativity is exhaustible. But our creativity is not exhaustible, it's inexhaustible. So getting rid of the stuff that's not as good leaves a lot more room in terms of your word count, but also a lot more energy to get after the stuff that you really want to be writing about. The second thing about audience and genre, you know, at some point, it's good to know what genre you're working in. It's good to know who your audience is, and it's good to know how you want to reach them. These things can get very abstract. So what I like to do when I'm editing, self-editing, is to have some audience members in mind. I'm sure a lot of you do this already. You know, it may actually occur where you actually just started writing and you had these people in mind, or they occur to you while you're writing. You know who would really like that sentence, or you know who would really like this concept, or you know who I want to share this with when I'm done. That's your audience. Keeping your audience in mind can help you keep you honest, because writing is very solitary. Even if we get together for a critique group, or even if we're writing together in the same room, we're not writing together. We're writing alone. So keeping these people in your mind, I think is a good way to proceed. Okay, so next major category is about order. Number 3, questions to be answered. I feel like this is really important. There was a playwright once, Louis Catron, who said, when the questions are answered, the play is over. So if you're working with plot at all, and even if you're working with a memoir, there's still questions about the character or characters that are going to unfold. There have to be questions. If there's a place where things feel really dead, it's probably because there's no question. You know, these questions can be as plot-based, who done it, to character-based, you know, is this person going to find themselves, and everywhere in between. One of the things about self-editing when you drill down to the next level is to ask yourself, do you have too many questions going at once? So that's kind of overwhelming the reader. That's the feeling like they're in Grand Central Station, or you know, whatever the equivalent is here, I don't know. You know, is there a major question? Because having that major question is where you're going to get your dramatic tension from. It's not just people arguing, it's not even necessarily a super dire situation. That's not really where you get the most dramatic tension from. You get the dramatic tension from engaging the reader on a psychological level where they feel like they're the character and they have the same question that your character does, or your narrator if it's a memoir. So, you know, the trick is to stagger these questions so that when one resolves, it starts a new question or a parallel question takes over. There's a lot of different ramifications about it. But narrative arcs and plot holes is our next item. It kind of feeds into that. If you're used to thinking about narrative arcs, if you're used to charting your own narrative arcs, there are some tools out there for that. I think that's good to help you identify the plot holes, why something isn't working, and also, is it smooth? Is it a smooth narrative arc, or is it super choppy? A lot of up and down, up and down. These are, you know, when you're thinking about the arcs in particular, that can help you with a lot of opportunity to write a new scene, right? So if it's super choppy, writing a new scene between events can help it become a little more gentle as you're getting from one place to another, right? We've all read these things where we're going along, and we hit this speed bump, and it's not quite surprise, it's more like the writer just figured it out, and now they're giving it to you, and you're like, oh, good thing you got your seatbelt on, you know? So writing some scenes to smooth out the ride, I think, is good. When we talk about order, there's two different ways of ordering material. I realize this is a very high level overview, and I'm trying to get through everything in the 45 minutes I was allotted. So, also to whet your appetite for 4 hours of this later, you know? So as far as order goes, it can either be chronological or narrative. Narrative order means that we're putting things just basically not in non-chronological order for impact. Most people are writing in chronological order. It's a choice you want to make. I think a lot of times you'll see these books now, this has been going on for a while, in which the whole book is chronological, except it starts with this one scene that's out of order, right? They put that first. That's to, Richard? Is that you? Yeah.
No, John.
John, sorry. That's what you were saying about the first page?
Yeah.
Right? It's like, that's a lot of times how, you know, we think we're gonna grab somebody's attention is by taking the most dramatic scene from the middle of the book, sticking it at the beginning, and then we go back and go all chronologically. That is a way to do it. I don't know that that's the only way to do it. I think people have started thinking that's the best way to do it, and it may or may not be to your material. So thinking about the order is good. Thinking about flashbacks versus memories, I think, is another thing to sort of have your mind on, and the difference between those. I'm gonna call your attention to the Book Architecture website, just because there's a library there of articles that are free to access that we've written over the last 20 years. And one of them is about the 5 rules of flashbacks. Yeah?
I'm sorry, what was that again, that website?
Bookarchitecture.com.
Okay.
Those 2 words put together. It's a little long, and when I'm trying to spell out my email address to the people at Hertz, they're like, does it have to have 19 letters in it? And I'm like, I don't know, you know, I guess. I'm a literary type, you know, so stay with me. 5 Rules of Flashbacks is the article that I'm talking about right now on the library section of bookarchitecture.com. And basically, a flashback is where you leave the scene, you go into another scene, which could be 3 pages, it could be 7 pages, and then you're coming back to the unfolding action. Whereas a memory is just something that might take 3 sentences, it might take a paragraph and a half, but the character hasn't left the scene. So, you know, knowing the difference between those, knowing which ones you're using, knowing, ideally with all these tools we want to use them all, unless we don't like them for some reason, so you're adding tools to your toolkit. Okay. So, scene. Scene is, I think, probably the most important tool to develop, and scenic writing which puts people in a place, and it brings in the sensual details of the room, or, you know, it's like we could talk about this scene right here, especially from my perspective, it's very interesting. But, you know, we would want to talk about the fact that it's a little hot, right? I'm not complaining, I'm just saying, you know, it's, the air, it's a little, the air's a little thick, right? And yet the fans are going, and people are being pretty quiet. Occasionally, there's a little smattering of talking, not that I mind, you know what I mean? But it's like, now we're in this scene. Whereas if I'm just gonna stand here and tell you, you know, well, I went to this place and I did this thing, that's all telling. So we know showing as opposed to telling is the thing that brings the reader physiologically into the scene. And then during a scene, you know, something has to happen. And because that thing happened, something has to change. Those are the first two definitions of scene. If you come September 30th, that's my last plug, I swear. I'll tell you what the other three definitions of scene are. No, I'm just kidding. You can email me anytime, and I'll tell you that. But I won't tell you today, because we're moving on. So, if you're wondering why am I stuck somewhere? Why does this not feel like it's moving? You have to ask yourself, is something happening in this scene? Or is it just me describing something that I thought was interesting once, or sort of going within the character's thoughts for long periods of time, but nothing's happening? So something has to happen, and then because that thing happens, something changes. So, you know, could be the nature of the relationship is changing based on what happens in the scene. Could be that the reader's understanding is changing. Okay, show don't tell, I think we already talked about a little bit. That is the most commonly heard expression in writing circles. It's an overused generality, but it's also been around for at least 100 years. And, you know, I don't think it gets any better. Except I will say that it's a little more subtle than just show don't tell. So in the old school novels from like England in the 1700s, they would have summary, then a scene, then a summary. You may very well be reading or have read books like this. That's sort of like tell, show, tell. And that works, you know, or show and tell, if you remember back to elementary school, right? When you brought something in, you wouldn't just show it, you would also tell about it. So it's a little more nuanced than just show, don't tell. But. And then finally, links and segmentation. So if you have a great scene, and you have a great scene that comes next, you've done most of the work, but you haven't done all of it. You are going to want to link those scenes together if they're in the same chapter, and then you're going to want to segment those apart from the other groups of scenes. So I think it's, you know, occasionally you'll see books where every scene is a chapter, and it's just chapter, chapter, chapter. It gets very static. You may have done this yourself too. It gets a very staccato experience of reading, where a chapter could be 3 scenes, could be 7 scenes. It could be a mini experience all in itself, where there's a scene that opens things up. There's a scene that develops things. There's a scene that brings that chapter to a climax. There's a scene that concludes that chapter. And that chapter is about one thing. So it's sort of a mini experience of unity that readers really appreciate. That was a really good chapter. It's probably a result of having multiple scenes contributing to the same effect, as opposed to just being like chapter 23, you know, scene 23. So chapters should be built. Okay, tone. This is a hard one to do for yourself. It's easier when you have someone else editing you, but sometimes it's hard to be honest with someone about their tone. Which is also the same thing as saying their voice. And there's several different levels to this. The first one I have here is vocabulary and diction. You know, you could say, well, I don't really like the slang here, or it feels like that character, you don't really know them that well, you just sort of pulled them as a stock character from a culture that you don't know very well and threw them in here, and it's kind of clanging on my ears a little bit. But then there's also like the jokes that don't land, or you might offend somebody, and you want them to be able to say that, because you may change it and you may not. But you want them to at least be able to say, you know, I didn't really care for that kind of language, or whatever the case might be. So that is your audience, and you want to know whether you're reaching them. And if you turn somebody off, well, you might be doing that on purpose, right? There is a certain amount of controversy where you can make some hay, but if you're not doing it on purpose and you turn somebody off, sometimes it's a while before they come back, and sometimes they don't come back at all. So you kind of have to know your audience also. Right, let's move on to characters. When you are self-editing, I think it's good to think about point of view. Point of view, I'm sure everybody is familiar on some level with this, but it's basically whose eyes you're seeing the events through, right? So you have a character or a narrator, and you are seeing the events through their eyes. So when somebody else that they're talking to is moving around, they're describing this person's actions. Sometimes you might have an omniscient point of view where we're sort of not in one person's head. And whatever choice you're making, it's completely up to you. It should suit your material and your interest. But what you don't want to do is randomly shift the POV just because you needed to figure out something, you know? So like sometimes, you know, I'm editing a book and it'll be like, there's two characters, there's a man and a woman, and we alternate, and it's great, right? So we hear from the man, we hear from the woman, we hear from the man, we hear from the woman. Sometimes we get two from the men, and then we get one from the woman, back and forth. And then we get chapter 33 is from the point of view of the mayor, because I didn't know how else to get that material into the book, you know? And it's like, no, it's a problem, but that's not the solution to the problem. So thinking about your point of view is always useful when you are self-editing. Characters is another thing to be thinking about. You know, you could be thinking about those flat characters that don't evolve and aren't supposed to evolve versus round characters who do evolve, right? That's E.M. Forster. 9 times out of 10, when I'm editing a book, maybe 9.5 out of 10, there are too many characters. There are too many characters in a scene, filling up the scene and confusing us as to what's happening. Sometimes there are too many characters doing the same thing. There's a villain, but then there's this person's also kind of a villain, and then that person's a villain, and it's like, well, maybe can we combine these characters? People get very offended, you know, when I say, can we combine these 3 characters? They're like, no, they're all so separate. I'm like, they are, but they're all doing the exact same thing. And they're like, oh, well, I'll combine those 2. Be like, okay, we're making progress. Relationships, I think, is another thing you want to be thinking about. So if you have characters, a lot of times authors will think about their character, and they'll get to know their character. So they might do things like write a 2 to 3 page backstory that doesn't go in the book, where this character went to school, what this character's favorite food is, what their favorite color is. You know, there are these various techniques for getting to know your character. And you can tell when an author knows the character or not. It's usually it could be based on someone they know, but they've made the effort to bring in a bunch of other things, so it kind of does move into fiction. But sometimes the characters don't know each other that well. So that's another thing that you can be thinking about. How well do the characters know each other? Because otherwise it'll just seem like an author kind of creating this world, as opposed to this world existing. The category is about theme. So ideally you should be able to state your theme in 4 sentences. That's also your elevator pitch, which if you go to the agent Zoom, I don't think you'll be doing live elevator pitches, but if you ever corner an agent, you want to have your elevator pitch, and that's, I guess it's something you'll be able to describe in the course of 1 elevator ride, is where it got its name. So hopefully you're on a high floor when you guys get on there. But you know, a 4-sentence statement of what your book is about can be very helpful during revision. Because you might find, and I've written about this in several places, but if you go to the library on the book architecture website, there's a piece called Finding Your Theme. That might be, you know, a place to go look. If you have a 4-sentence statement of what your book is about, and you look at your chapters, and you look at your characters, and you look at your scenes, and you look at your open questions, and all that stuff of revision, it could really help you. Because sometimes you find that there's this material lurking in there that just doesn't go in there, and it's never gone in there. And you can just take it out, sort of like an appendix, or those other organs you don't really need. I think that might be the only one. I feel like maybe a spleen, I'm not sure. So, yeah, what am I missing? You need the spleen? Okay. Thank you for that. Being edited in live time here. Okay, length, I think, you know, when you feel your interest dragging in a scene, it's probably because it's too long. And you don't really need somebody else to tell you if you don't care about it either. So that's one of my favorite things to write in a critique, you know, getting a little long in here. It's not very specific, but I think it's helpful. Difficult subjects and red flags. I mean, this all depends on how intentional you want to be. Are you going for shock value? Are you espousing a certain point of view? In our culture, as we know right now, it's tricky, it's treacherous, doesn't matter what it is you're trying to say, getting somebody to shut down is pretty easy. And so, are you doing that on purpose? Or would you like them to hear what you have to say? And would you like to move into some kind of nuanced or rich discussion of what you have to say? Then you might want to back up and not have certain things that are going to alienate them, whatever the case might be. I don't know, you know, I'll leave that to you to sort out what that is. And then point of fact. Something that's always helpful from your beta readers, your critique partners, your, you know, whoever's reading your book, is when they actually just say that fact is wrong, like the spleen, you know. I'm writing, the novel I'm writing is about baseball, and I have the Houston Colts in there. That was their name for, I guess, 2 years before they became the Astros, and one of my beta readers was like, actually it was the Houston Colt 45s, yeah. Which is kind of a terrible name when you think about it. It's kind of amazing also at the same time. You know, when Ed pointed that out, he wasn't like trying to show me that he knew more than me. He was helping me. Because somebody could be reading that and know that actually they weren't the Houston Colts, and now they don't really trust me about other things. Or it's almost like when there's too many spelling mistakes in a published book, you're like, I don't know what your limit is. If I see 2, I'm like, I don't know, you know? So if you have information that somebody else might need, you should volunteer it, because as writers we want to get it right. And as a writer you want to do your research. So no more spleen comments from me, only appendix comments. You know? And as a PS to that, sometimes when I'm working on a nonfiction book, someone's like, we'll just put that in the appendix. Every time I try to take something out, they're like, can I put that in the appendix? And I'm like, there's a reason the appendix got its name, and it's that you don't need it. All right, well, I think that concludes what I have to say. And
we're going to get right back to you, though.
We're going to get right back to me. Okay.
Yeah, is that okay?
Of course.
Thank you so much. Very thoughtful.
Who couldn't be here today. Yes. Well, I don't know what kinds of Q's we have, and I don't know what kind of A's I have, but I'm happy to repeat the question in case anybody didn't hear it. Does anybody have a question? Did anybody? Yes, please.
Well, I'm doing my very first thing in the second draft, and I have a huge problem because my main person is in a coma. And the housekeeper is now the only one that can take care of things. So how do I move from first
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, the first part of the book is written from the point of view of the character before she enters a coma?
Yes.
And so now you're in the second part of the book where this character is in a coma. That's a very good question. I don't know how much agency the housekeeper could get, but if this becomes a person who can tell the story, and then we get to know this person, and they're interesting, and they have some observations about life, and they have some, they are actually part of the story themselves. I think you could make a POV shift. I'm not against POV shifts at all. I just feel like it needs to be clear, and everybody needs to get roughly the same proportion, so she could get the second part. Maybe the character wakes up in the third part. Maybe it gets passed off to someone else for the third part. I don't know. You could also have a disembodied narrator. It's the woman in the coma. I don't think that's gonna work, but it could, you know. That was a hard first question. I was like expecting like a softball or something. You know, like, well, can you tell us a little more about, you know, something, slow pitch, instead of going like right down the little brushback pitch there. All right, what else?
I know one point.
Okay.
In a Western movie, you see all of the characters fighting in a brawl in the saloon. And maybe 5 of them are your focus in that brawl. So when it's written, not in script, but it's written in a Western novel, how would you keep all those fighting characters separate but equal with all that background noise going on?
Yeah, it's a good point. So I think there's a difference between film and books. In film, it's much easier to register different people more quickly because they are wearing a certain color, or because they're wearing a hat, or because they have some facial disfigurement, or because they've already been shot, or whatever. It's much more holistic and immediate. In a book, I think you really need to devote a paragraph to a character before you move on to the next character. You want to give them something that's identifying, that is always, and without making it cheap, like you don't want them to just like have a lisp or something that's like low-hanging fruit, you know? Oh, that's the guy with the lisp, you know? But maybe have something like some kind of verbal tick, repeating something, or someone who speaks in a certain very flowery professorial language, or something where then we like, it's different enough that we grab it and we know that that's who this person is, or super young, or super old, or you know, just something that we're just able to identify very quickly who that is. But crowd scenes are difficult to write. And they're easier though towards the end than they are at the beginning. So if you are, let's say I'm working on this novel that is about baseball. Okay, so getting to know the characters individually at greater length earlier, but then we get to the end where they're playing in the semifinals game. You can hear something from one, and you can hear something from the, hopefully, I mean, my editors will tell me, you can hear something from someone else, and but we know who they are, and so it's easier to have that kind of crowd scene during the game than it would be at the beginning. Is that helpful?
Yeah, and I can use names sparingly, just the top 5 that are in the title.
Right. I had to, yeah. I had to learn that the hard way, that not everybody needs a name. Okay. Yes?
Earlier, when you were comparing flashbacks to memories, you said that flashbacks leave a scene and go into another scene. Okay. And then we were talking about the length compared to, okay. My question is, the purpose of a flashback, is it to add depth to the character, or does it help promote the story? Does it push the story forward? Or can it do both?
I mean, ideally, everything does both. As we were talking a little bit during the break, ideally, everything adds depth and also propels the story.
Okay.
I mean, that's the challenge, right? That's like rubbing your head and patting your belly at the same time, you know, or playing drums. It's like, it doesn't get there right away, but if you work on it, ideally it does both of those things. Flashbacks sometimes can give us information that we need to have at a certain time, that if we knew it already, it would ruin the suspense, or there just wasn't the occasion to tell us. Sometimes it can, change our perspective on someone's motivation. I think the most important thing about flashbacks, though, is that they still need to be relatively brief. And they still need to return us to the scene where we were last time. Unless you're really doing something very literary where it's like we're here, and then we flash back and we end up here, and then you flash back and you end up there. I mean, that gets very difficult for someone to follow unless that becomes the pattern that kind of there is no pattern. I don't know. That would give me a headache if I were reading something like that, I think.
Thanks.
Yes?
You mentioned that point of view changes from a different person's perspective, that they kind of have to be balanced in the length. What about a manuscript that the main character, generally the same POV, but throughout it there are different people, different chapters of the point of view from different characters. But they're not all the same, like this character and then this character and then this character from their point of view, kind of interspersed.
And why are you doing?
Do you have any?
Why are you doing that?
The reason I'm doing that is because at the end there has to be a POV from the parents. There has to be, so throughout the book I'm putting others from other point of view so it won't be jarring or so out of place. That's the reason.
Okay, I don't know enough about it to issue any proclamation. I don't know that you are going to accomplish that by doing this. I think to accomplish that, you're saying there has to be a point of view from the parents, presumably somebody dead or something, and that's why it has to be from the parents? Or why does it have to be from the parents at the end?
Oh, well, it's dealing with mental illness, not with death.
Okay. So this is the point of view that's sane, or I don't know what the right word is, but you know,
Right,
we're going to be
right.
able to comprehend.
To show the contrast, to show the rest of the information. But does it have to be, do those point of views have to be balanced in length or?
No, I think in that case,
and then it
if
kind
you
of
have
scattered through?
if you have a character who's losing their sanity over the course of the book, and then by the end, listening to them wouldn't really be intelligible, I think having the parents speak in some kind of epilogue as a one-off, I think could work. I don't know that the other smattering of POVs is going to, maybe it could prepare us for that, I don't know. I'm going to table that one. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about the book that you're writing now?
Well, which part, the process or the content? I can talk process all day long. The 4 lines. So, well, it's about baseball and sexual assault. As I told someone, something for everyone. It's basically about sexual assault of young males in youth sports, which is a very untreated subject. I think sexual abuse of young males is in particular very underreported, underrepresented. And you know, at the same time, this love of sports is something that a lot of young men bond together over, and how they find out who they are by you know, competing. Something that, you know, being very gendered here, but something that young women generally don't do as often, compete against each other as a way of expressing love or having a camaraderie. So it's kind of when that gets shattered, and that's a high school scene. That's a whole high school timeline. Then there's a timeline of this boy as he becomes as a man, whose marriage is falling apart, and he has drug and alcohol problems, and but maybe there's some redemption, ... Okay, that's all I'm gonna say. It's definitely more than I've talked about it, but yeah, okay, I don't think it was 4 sentences, you know what I mean, but you gotta hone that. that elevator pitch. Yes?
I'm curious how long ago you developed the book architecture process and how long it took and what led you to develop the book architecture?
Oh, that's a really good question. So book architecture is a process by which you can organize your material for revision, in which you can figure out what the best parts of it are, in which you can use a variety of tools like a grid or a archery target or charting arcs to bring it all to life. I was teaching, and I was teaching in Boston, and I was just sort of doing it without really knowing I was doing it. This isn't what I wanted to be when I grew up, by the way. You know, but I was just kind of doing it. And someone said in one of my classes, they were like, where's the book that teaches me how to do all this? And I was like, well, I'm sure it's out there, so I'll go find 3 for you, and I'll bring them next week, and then whichever ones you don't want, I'll return them. And so long story short, that wasn't there. I'm not saying that I'm the only person who writes about exercises or strategies or tools, but just not in a way that was making sense to me. So that's what my work is. It's, you know, the way that it makes sense to me, which has made sense to a bunch of other people, not everyone, right? I was just looking over my Amazon reviews, and they were really pretty good, except I saw this one guy who gave me 1 star out of 5, and I was like, all right, let's not be defensive, because, you know, when we're being edited, we don't want to be defensive. Let's drill down. So I kind of went to his section, you know, and it turns out he gave the Beatles' White Album 1 star also. And I was like, all right, maybe he just doesn't know how the star system works. You know what I mean? Maybe there's something about Glass Onion that he just can't handle, and he really wishes it was I Want to Hold Your Hand. I don't know. Anyway, it's rambling. I'm rambling now. Yes?
Just in your fiction writing, this has been asked before, but I'm just curious. Do you write your end before the rest of your story, or do you let your story take you to the end?
I like to do it very organically. It actually started as a short story. Actually, so I was just reflecting on this on the drive here. And it came to me as a short story, like all at once. I had just finished packing up our house to move from one coast to the other. So it was like this tremendous exertion that was now over, and then the story came. So I wrote the story, and I shared it with some people, and they said, well, we want to know what happens to these people, we want to know what happened before this, and so it turns out the story turned out to be chapters 2 and 4 of a 11-chapter novel. So I didn't really know what I was doing. I think it's better that way. There are people who don't agree with that, and you know, who like to have a lot of outlines in place, who always want to have the end in mind. I think you have to know who you are. Sometimes you hear this like pantser versus outliner, right? It's like somebody who reads by the seat of their pants versus someone who likes to have everything organized. I think it might be, we're all probably somewhere in the middle, because I think even pantsers have some kind of idea, some note somewhere, and even outliners will allow that the material they're working on is taking them in a new direction, so it isn't quite so polarized. But I think early drafts being pantsed, if that's the verb, it's more fun, and it's, you know, it's more like you don't really know what you're doing, so I don't know why you have to pretend that you know what you're doing, and this is a way to like not know what you're doing in a proactive, kind of enjoyable way, and then figure out what you did, and then make it better.
So you're saying outliners are more like work?
Yeah, I mean, there's sometimes that outlining is really useful. It's like, you know, anytime you get your life together, you know, like when you're logging in to, like, you know, tell them you're coming for the plane 24 hours exactly ahead of time, you know, and you're like ready to push. Like, it's good to sometimes be organized. but you don't want to miss the life of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We can do one more question.
One more question. Okay, let's make it a real easy one. Just kidding. Send me back to San Diego happy. This isn't about me, this is about you. Do you have a question?
Question over here.
Yes?
The information that you provided, is it in a handout or anything today, the information that you shared?
It's not.
Huh?
It is not.
Oh, it's not.
I'm sorry, but I'm telling you that if you go to bookarchitecture.com,
Okay.
bookarchitecture.com, you go to the library page, there's 20 articles there. And it will have 25. There's 25 articles there. They're all like 500 words. It will tell you more than you want to know. Okay, who do I hand this to? You? The new president.
To Dwight. Where's Dwight?
The old president. I'm confused. He left already. Dwight was like, I'm done.